Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and Dr. Jonathan Cook. Today, we'll be discussing Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. There's a really touching audiobook version of this over at LibriVox that I highly recommend that everyone go and check out. That's part of how I did my preparation for this. And a couple of the other things I did in preparation for this conversation today were to look up some primary source material from JSTOR and record those, the ones that are in the public domain over at noetic.online. And I hope you enjoy those educational resources over there right now. It's been a little while since I've had contact with this text, so I think Dr. Cook is going to have to jog my memory. And I'm sure many questions and disputes will arise out of this because it gets to be a pretty political book. And there's much I agreed with the political analysis of this text, but there's a lot that I found wanting as well, if memory serves me correctly. But I will stop providing a dissertation on it and ask my first question to Dr. Cook. And maybe just if you could talk about the circumstances that led to the composition of this novel.
Yeah. So The Jungle was it was written in 1905 after Sinclair went to Chicago to research the conditions of the stockyards in November and December 1904. Now, he was a very young man at that time. He was, born in 1878. He was living in New Jersey in really kind of primitive circumstances with his wife Meta and their son David. He had a young son. And he was very poor at the time. He'd just written a book about the Civil War called Manassas. So he had published some fiction already, and but he was not at all well known. He had no money, and the reason, but he was a firmly committed to socialism at this time, which he saw as, like Jack London and others at the beginning of the 20th century, saw the vast power of these trusts and the corporations, and saw the injustice to workers and this vast income inequality that is something that we know today as well. But anyway, so his sympathies were definitely in favor of socialism. Now this was 1904, 1905, before any real institution of Marxism had taken place. But anyway, there was a meatpackers' strike in Chicago in 1904, which the strikers lost. And Sinclair was interested in this, and he wanted to research the conditions of meatpackers and maybe write a novel about what was going on there to bring attention to the plight of workers. And so he arranged to go to Chicago to interview people and to find out, more about the meatpacking business. And he got a deal with a magazine, a sort of a muckraking magazine in Kansas called The Appeal to Reason. And they said that they would publish anything he wrote about what he discovered in Chicago. So when he got to Chicago, he met various people to tell him what conditions were like. He talked to workers in the plants. He talked to Jane Addams at Hull House, the famous settlement house that was there to help workers and immigrants. He talked to a British scientist named Adolphus Smith, who was he was actually doing research himself on the conditions in the stockyards, and he told Sinclair pretty much that the European slaughterhouse methods, which were much more humane and conscious of the risks of contamination and chemical, infection from tainted meats, So this British scientist was telling Sinclair that about giving really hardcore professional information about how the American slaughterhouses were much more geared towards efficiency and money making and using every little scrap of the animal, and then using downer cows, animals that were obviously sick, recycling old meats, just doing things that were putting the public's health at risk, just to make a profit. So as a result of interviews with lots of different people, and basically 7 weeks of going around talking to people, both professionals and those working in the stockyards, he had gathered a whole lot of information, and he went home to New Jersey in 1904, and he began writing the book actually on Christmas Day, 1904, and spent a lot of 1905 writing it, and it was being published in installments in the Appeal to Reason. It began in, I think, February, ran till November in the Appeal to Reason. Actually, they didn't finish it. The editor of the Appeal to Reason complained that the story was lagging and readers were tired of it. And so the idea was that if readers really wanted the end of the novel, they should write to the magazine, and they would send them to them personally, the final installment of the story. But in the meantime, Sinclair had gone to New York publishers, and he went to Macmillan, and he got a $500 advance to publish the book form of the novel. But then when, in 1905, when he showed them what he had written, Macmillan started getting cold feet because they thought that they might have a lawsuit from the meatpackers against them for slander. And they were worried about the book being overly melodramatic or exaggerated, so they eventually canceled publication of the book. And luckily for Sinclair, he was able to go to one of the another prestigious publisher at the time, Doubleday Page, and a young reader at Doubleday Page took the book and stayed up until 2 or 3 in the morning to read it, and said that they had to publish it, and but they ended up having to check out the veracity of its claims, and so that was something that had to be arranged so that the publisher could be assured that everything that was being described in the book was true. And that checked out, fortunately for Sinclair, and the book was eventually published in early 1906, and created a sensation. It sold 100,000 copies in the first year. A copy was sent to Theodore Roosevelt because the idea of improving the sanitary conditions of workers in the packing houses had been something that had concerned the government for several years. I mean, it was almost like Sinclair's book was just sort of the icing on the cake, because people had been complaining about bad meat, and Theodore Roosevelt himself, who was the president, had known that during the Spanish-American War that a bunch of soldiers had been killed by the tainted meat that they had consumed, as soldiers. So it was a very timely book when it was published, because it it jibed with a lot of what people were saying about the tainted meat in these slaughterhouses, but it was also part of the general muckraking or muckraking movement at the time that was pervasive, in the 1890s, early 20th century. Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens, and there's a book called The Treason of the Senate, which was published in 1905, 1906, that was an attack on the corruption of the government, of the Congress, because of special interests. Something very familiar today.
Oh,
so
yeah.
anyway, that's how this book emerged.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you're saying is causing a lot of memories of the text to come flooding back, and it's also precipitating a bunch of questions too. So let me see if I can get my mind completely around this. Something I found so fascinating. Let me just see if I can enumerate the things that came to mind. Something I found so fascinating about what you just said and corresponds to all the research that I've done in intellectual history stuff is this way of publishing in serial fashion, not like producing a work just out of, creation ex nihilo, the things you had patrons and subscribers and they would sort of give you an advance and pay for a book in installments. And that just seems so alien and foreign to the present day. But I wonder if there is a correlate to how books are produced or how ideas and intellectualism is sort of financed today. What would be the analog? And I start to think about what I'm building with this, social media subscription audio company or whatever, if that's something like that. I think that's so interesting and such an interesting historical fragment that
periodical publication was, it was kind of the norm in the 19th century. Dickens, all the great Victorian writers were doing it, up through Thomas Hardy, who published
do we
most
have
of his
anything
novels
like that today?
as serials. Well, we don't have, magazines don't publish fiction. Or they rarely do. No, I think that pretty much dropped off at the beginning of the 20th century. You had great magazines doing short stories in the early 20th century, and even today you have the New Yorker and maybe Harper's publishing fiction, but in
it seems like it would be a good. It seems like it would be a good model for struggling writers out there. I just kept thinking to myself, this is a great business plan that people could use. They could crowdsource, could they use things like Kickstarter or something that? Because I know a ton of struggling writers, but if you're like, hey, look, X amount of dollars goes to produce X chapters per month.
Yeah.
I think that would be really wonderful. I'm not sure how it would work in applied reality. I'm trying to think about the other things that I noticed that I thought were particularly interesting about this. That you said that they were concerned that he might be sued for slander, but I think it's interesting because the book itself doesn't.
It's a work of fiction, yeah.
Yeah, it's a work of fiction. So, how does that work? Obviously, there's a lot of truth in this work. And by the way, I should say that I do think it's a beautiful novel and incredibly touching and filled with so much rich detail.
Yeah.
But how? Well, it doesn't purport to be a documentation of the events. It may be based on things that were occurring, but it's fictional.
Yeah. That's a good point, and I don't know what the laws of libel are if you can sue someone for depicting you too closely in a work of fiction. It was clear that Durham's, which was the slaughterhouse that Jurgis begins working in, is model on Philip Armour's, the Armour meat slaughterhouse. Armour and Swift were the two big names in meatpacking at the times, and in the book it's Durham and Jones who are the controlling packers. So, but I think. These people were so powerful. These robber barons or whatever you want to call them. They were so powerful. They had their senators. They had their congressmen. They were multimillionaires. They had their agents in the press. They were really kind of big dogs that you didn't want to have barking at you because you could really suffer. As a result, they could really step on you. So it just was a reminder how powerful, the industrialists of that era were. These big creators of trusts. They just they ruled the country basically, and it took a Roosevelt to try to break them down and put them in their place, which
Well, and this raises the other question, because I think this book is incredibly timely, especially when we take into consideration our understanding of media and the press and stuff like that. Do we have Upton Sinclairs out there who are willing to really dig up this stuff? See, and this is the thing. This is the real problem, is that, are we sure that these interests of the industrialists, whatever we want to call them, the robber barons, industrialists, if that's been completely done away with, and that we really do have that true and honest voice in the press, or if people like that, when they crop up, if they're considered fringe and outsiders and not to be listened to? How do we know that we're not in a similar situation?
Well, I think we have. I don't want to get off track here too much.
Sure. I'm sorry.
There were magazines, McClure's magazine. There were muckraking outlets, but they weren't nearly as powerful as the people who were running the economy. But there was a sort of a middle class that was of reformers who were able to publish, and they were constantly looking for allies, and they were looking to influence Congress. And it just it took a long time for anything to happen, but eventually under Roosevelt and then Wilson, you got some laws passed to look out for the common good of all the people. But it took decades to remedy some of the problems that were just flagrant, already after the Civil War. It was just a long struggle, because people weren't willing to acknowledge the disequilibrium in power. They thought that workers, unions were bad because everyone should just be self-reliant. The individual was the powerful force in the world, and if you were trying to unionize, it showed that you were just a sort of weak-minded person who couldn't fight it out on their own. But instead of realizing that these massive corporations, the only way for workers to get any kind of power to fight back and get fair wages was to unionize and to strike. So the history of the country is a very violent one in the 1890s and in the early 20th century. And that history was repeated again during the Depression in the 1930s. So
and what I think is so great about this book too is it raises a very fundamental question about, something that I experienced when I was reading this is that I recollected something that my grandfather told me when he was still alive. He was a steel mill worker, and who had to endure a lot of really terrible conditions early in his career.
Yeah.
But then later things improved.
Where
in
was
Ohio.
this?
In Ohio.
Yeah.
And he dropped out of 5th grade. He was pretty much illiterate. I won't go into too much of it, but I think one of the things I do recall him telling me was that he did think that the unions were necessary at some point, but then he felt like things had changed and didn't feel the necessity of them. So he had been on both sides of it, and whether, this is a larger conversation about economics and equilibrium and when it is and is not on target. We should be talking about the particulars of the book, but it does inflame these conversations about what the right mix is between aspects of socialism and aspects of individualism or just blind capitalism or whatever you want to call it. And it seems like there is this sort of dynamic tension between these two ideologies, and that either one it can be really catastrophic, where you see the individual can be incredible and devalued and snuffed out, or you can see Marxist socialist programs implemented by very flawed human beings and leading to totalitarian governments. So, which Upton Sinclair wasn't aware of when he was writing this, right? He didn't really know
No.
The thing is, I like about what Upton did here is he really properly diagnoses the disease,
Yeah.
but he's very pie in the sky about the ideal that he's striving for.
Yeah.
And it'd be interesting to know what he would write if he got to see it obtain in physical reality in some way, and if he would pump the brakes on it.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying about unions is that in the book, Jurgis has a chance to join the union. He does join the union, but he becomes disillusioned with it because it seems like they're just as corrupt as anyone else in Chicago at the time. I mean, they get involved in vote fixing, and it's not seen as a viable protection for the worker, even though it could be that Sinclair's not being fair to the unions at the time. I don't know exactly enough about unionization in Chicago, the workers, but it's interesting too because one of the inspirations for the book came from the account of a Lithuanian worker in Chicago in the stockyards that Sinclair got from a book collection about workers collected by a guy he met. And this guy's story, a true life story, it was only like a 25-page overview of his life. In this guy's story, he actually ends up joining the union, the American Federation of Labor, and succeeds in getting a fair wage. So Sinclair took part of this guy's story and as an inspiration for an immigrant, a typical immigrant facing this unknown environment, and he made Jurgis's story much more troubled and catastrophic until the very end, when he discovers the miracle of socialism, which in a scene of, it's really a scene of religious conversion.
Well, that was a big thing that that was a big thing too, is how it's weird because Upton seems to have, on the one hand, syncretized socialism and Christianity and pitched socialism as like this ultimate that it's socialism is going to lead to the New Jerusalem or something like that, right? Like this is ultimately the codification of Christ's teachings, but at the same time, I get the vibe that Upton Sinclair was not a religious man.
Well,
so he's like kind of having trying to have his cake and eat it too.
Jesus was one of his heroes, along with Percy Shelley.
Right.
He admired the personality of Christ to no end. He was one of his heroes.
He wouldn't have called himself a Christian.
He's not a traditionally religious person, but he admires the message of social justice he found in the New Testament. But let me just get back to the end of the book and the pattern of the novel. Well, two important influences on the novel are Uncle Tom's Cabin and Pilgrims Progress. So just like you have Uncle Tom, who has all these terrible things happen to him one after the other. I mean, things go well for a little while and then something terrible happens. He has a decent job at the Shelby mansion, and then he gets sold, down to the markets of New Orleans, and then, he's with the Sinclair family. He's okay for a while, and then he gets his master gets killed, and he gets sold to Simon Legree. So, the downward spiral of Uncle Tom, I think, was a partial model for Jurgis's series of terrible accidents and oppressions, because pretty much what Upton Sinclair said was that the slaughterhouse workers were the wage slavery of the early 20th century was the equivalent of the chattel slavery of the 19th century. So the other model, of course, is Pilgrims Progress, which was a very important boyhood text for him, just as it was for a lot of other writers. And so Jurgis's progress through life is a trial, and he faces all these terrible difficulties as he flies from the city of destructions to this sort of New Jerusalem that he finds at the end of the book. So just like Jurgis, is imprisoned at one point and has temptation and goes, spends some time in Vanity Fair, you find some interesting parallels between episodes of Pilgrims Progress and The Jungle, especially at the end of the book when the realization that socialism is going to save the world is kind of like the arrival of young Christian in Bunyan's book In the Celestial City, the arrival in heaven. So the book is really a sort of proto-allegory, that is The Jungle. Even though it's incredibly well documented, it's a realistic novel. It has features of naturalism as well, but in the end, it has a kind of religious allegory underlying it in terms of the progress of the soul from misery and corruption to redemption at the end.
I've come to appreciate Bunyan so much.
Yeah.
I think I'm not sure. I mean, well, at some point I'd love to talk about Pilgrim's Progress in depth with you, but it's amazing how much influence he had on writers like Bronte and Upton Sinclair and stuff like that.
And Melville and Hawthorne too.
Yeah. I love the Pilgrim's Progress, and it's something I only really found out about in the past year and a half, and I don't know if that's because it's fallen out of favor or something like that. I mean, I'm not trained in literature.
Every kid used to read it until probably through the 19th century. I don't know about the early 20th century, but I can't remember reading anyone after the 19th century saying it was an important boyhood influence. But certainly,
do you teach it at all?
What's that?
Do you teach it at all?
No, I haven't. I've just so anyway, so the book, people have problems with the end of the book. They have problems with the melodrama. They find it impossible that someone like Jurgis could face this incredible series of bad luck events. But I would counter that sometimes life is like this. I mean, you have the book of Job in the Old Testament, right? That's the archetypal model for a book like The Jungle. And then you have Uncle Tom's Cabin as the prototype for a book of social protest, just like Sinclair was attempting to do. And he was very much conscious of trying to duplicate Stowe's achievement in highlighting the injustice of slavery. Although, the irony, of course, for Sinclair was that he had intended to help the plight of the immigrant and the slaughterhouse worker and workers generally, the proletariat, the low-wage slave. And what he accomplished instead was helping to pass the first important Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. So people focused on the disgusting descriptions of the slaughterhouses and thought about the meat they were eating. They didn't look at the workers and say, oh, how can we help these people, and why can't we pay them better wages, and how can we improve the safety conditions for people working in factories. The middle class reader just sort of overlooked that and focused on the meat. So he was Sinclair was very disappointed by, even though the book made him famous and he made $600,000 from it or something like that. He made a substantial amount of money, but it didn't have the impact that he was hoping.
I this is the book that I know him for, but are there other texts of his that you think are really amazing? Like
Well, I'm just aware of his other writing. I mean, I've dipped into a little bit else, but I mean, he wrote just a phenomenal number of books. A lot of short novels. He wrote a lot of nonfiction. I mean, he was incredibly prolific. And he
that came
wrote
up in
the
my
book.
research.
He
Yeah.
wrote the book that the book called Oil. That
Yeah.
the movie. What was
Yeah.
the movie
The
with?
Country, No Country for Old Men, is that it?
No, no, no. This was. Oh, is it? I mean, they made it into a movie. It's about the oil business, California oil business. He wrote it in the 1920s, and it came out about 8 years ago. But I thought I mean, I haven't read the novel, but the movie itself was incredibly melodramatic.
Yeah,
And
There Will Be Blood.
There Will Be Blood. Yeah,
That's what it is.
yeah,
Sorry. I get No Country for Old Men, There Will Be
yeah.
Blood mixed up. I think they came out
Anyway,
at the
I
same
was.
time.
I mean, it started out as an interesting story, and it just turned into a ghastly melodrama, as far as I was concerned, for the film version of it. But Sinclair, he was prolific. He was outspoken. He was a socialist. He ran as a candidate for governor in California in the 1930s and lost. But he just kept plugging away at what he was doing. But he's most famous for The Jungle, when he really connected with his subject there. But I mean, who knows? Some of his other books might be revived. Um,
It's an interesting thing how history treats works, you know,
yeah.
and why it takes so long for things to be appreciated. Well, what do you think about this criticism of the book being pessimistic and then euphoric when he finds socialism? Do you not like that?
Well, it's interesting because he actually he had thought of a different ending. He thought of ending it with Jurgis in jail, being arrested at the end. Hearing the promise of socialism, but then actually going to jail and ending it there as, just not to have a sort of sugar-coated ending. But, I mean, as a work of propaganda, I mean, I think it's very inspirational.
Do you think it's propaganda? I don't.
mean, as a work of well, I don't propaganda not in the worst sense of the word, but just a sort of promotional of a message, of his message, of seeking, greater equality. But I mean, the point is, 99% of the book is a very scathing and largely accurate depiction of a society that is very unfair to people because of this massive economic inequality and the sort of hypocrisy of the country as supposedly a place of the American dream was, just not available to all these people, these immigrants and, workers. So it's just a perfect indication of why we don't want to live in a society of vast income inequality. I mean, it's just
totally.
when you have so much power concentrated in so few hands, when you have people who are able to buy Congress and buy candidates in elections and buy newspapers and buy the media to enforce their message, it's not a great place to live, and it's absolutely it's dangerous for democracy, because democracy dies when you have great disequilibrium of power. So, I mean, the book is very relevant today because of the immigrant aspect to it, because of the income inequality aspect, to the fact that, corporations, when they're not checked by governments, do dastardly things, and they kill people and they poison people, and that's a message that we still need to be reminded of today,
Yeah, I think that all these things are good to bring up. I think you and I are so familiar with the text that we take it for granted about what inspired such what about the book inspired so much moral outrage. I think one of the things that was like particularly outrageous for me was how normalizing uh uh like women were forced to whore themselves
Yeah,
out
yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, the whole Me Too
to
movement.
supervisors. Yeah.
You have Una, the wife, the dutiful wife, who's struggling to, be a good mother and to work when she needs to. She goes back to work because she needs to. Her husband, he has a twisted ankle. He has to stay home for several months. She goes to work, and her female boss gets her hooked up with this guy who basically forces her to have sex because, otherwise they can get fired, So this guy, Phil Collins, makes her his mistress and actually rapes her at one point. And it's likely that the child she's carrying, that she miscarries later on in the story, is his child. So, I mean, this is something that, I think was still true. It could be true today, where you have immigrant workers largely from South and Central America working in America's slaughterhouses, and where they are terrified of being deported, and the women who work in those conditions can be violated and abused very easily. The other thing is, I love the chapter where Jurgis goes to the home of Freddie Jones. It's chapter 24 of the novel, and he meets Freddie Jones, who's drunk on the streets, and Jones is the son of one of the major meat packers of Chicago at the time. And, he's drunk, and he befriends Jurgis and takes him home, and it's a sort of fairy tale fantasy, but it actually has an element of truth to it, where this guy I think he's only 18 or 19. He takes Jurgis home, gives him $100 and invites him in the house, this mansion, and Jurgis sees all this fancy furniture and paintings on the wall, and of course the butler is outraged that Freddie is bringing home this bum from the streets, but he can't do anything because Freddie tells the guy to back off. And then so Jurgis sees that the point is that he's all this misery and bad meat and exploitation of the labor force is all the ultimate goal is to provide the wealth that creates a character like Freddie Jones, who's a complete nincompoop, and all this mansion that's filled with this fake art and fancy food, so the accumulation of wealth at the top is just a kind of ridiculous waste of conspicuous consumption that would be much better spent giving the workers a better wage and protecting their health and making sure that the meat was not going to kill anyone that they were producing. So it's a satire on the absurdity of the lives of the rich and famous. This extravagance that is really corrosive to the wealthy people at the top. They don't need it; it just corrupts them, and that's what it shows. The dysfunctional family of Freddie Jones. We get a history of the family there because the sister is divorcing a guy, and it's a fucked up family that is inadvertently revealed by when Freddie talks to Jurgis at the table there when they're having food. So anyway, it's a little window into the frivolity and corrosiveness of great wealth, for people.
Yeah, it's so unimaginable to me. Like I think about if I was ever successful with this project, if ever,
if you had a mansion and
well, no, I don't. I would never. No, I would never have a mansion. But if I ever, figured out how to crack the code to make this like a very financially viable enterprise, and I think the principles are in place. I have confidence about that. But it's not. All I can think that I would do with it would be just to hire more people, to help me.
Right.
I can't imagine
Yes, do what you like to
ways.
do, and help other people. Live like you want to live.
Yeah, just give people jobs. I just can't imagine having this unchecked desire for stupid paintings and jet skis and like
Well,
I may, but maybe I don't know. Maybe if I get put into that position, I'll just find it totally irresistible, and I'll develop this taste for the finer things in life. I've never been there, so I don't know.
yeah, yeah,
But it is an interesting question about how I'm just so curious how greed can take over like that. It's an interesting psychological and philosophical question that if these chiefs of industry, have this unquantifiable amount of money that they wouldn't spread it around to the people that are making it so that they can thrive to
yeah,
begin with, and would rather adorn themselves with all this frivolous novelty. Like how does that sort of evil creep into the mind? It's a very interesting question about how uh, insipid and boring the nature of greed and evil is. And maybe that's for another day, but uh,
yeah.
I just can't understand it. I just can't
Yeah.
understand it. Maybe something you can help me understand though is this. You mentioned earlier how the novel might be naturalistic. What is a naturalistic novel? I deal with the term naturalistic in philosophy. But I'm not
Yeah.
sure I have the same understanding of
Well,
naturalistic.
naturalism is the literary movement that grew out of realism, and it was pretty much theorized by Zola. And the basic principle is that heredity and environment are so calculated that a human being just is destroyed by the accumulation of factors in their life because of where they live, and who they descend from. So it could be, where they get their genes from, or it could be the environment they grow in. They live in a slum, they work in a factory, but the whole principle is one of decline. So the novels show the destruction of a character over time, like Sister Carrie, the figure of Hurstwood, or Frank Norris is the other great naturalist, and the octopus and the pit. So these are parables of the relentless destruction of human beings because of these forces of nature, or forces coming from who they are and who they descend from. But it's a symptom of the later 19th century, when it seemed like there were massive forces at work in the economy that were relentlessly forcing people to struggle to survive, especially if they weren't privileged. But so you could call The Jungle a naturalistic novel throughout most of it, but the ending of the book, of course, completely upsets the notion that it conforms to that model, because the redemptive idea of socialism at the end just upends the whole formula for naturalism. But I mean, the book, published in 1906, that was very much a time for the flourishing of the novel, of the naturalistic novel. Dreiser was in 1900 he published Sister Carrie, and so the beginning of the 20th century is the great age for Theodore Dreiser's novels. And of course, Norris died in 1902, but his big era was the 1890s. But it was still a potent influence in American literature, and Sinclair, was very much aware of it. So it's a mixture of realism, naturalism. It's also, you could call it a Bildungsroman, a novel of education for the character of Jurgis, who is learning about life. I mean, he's not a youth. He's in his 20s, probably I guess in his late 20s, but he learns about American society and culture, throughout the book, and the whole book is about his education in what he needs to do to survive, and to realize that the breakup of his own family has to be, I mean, gives him all this freedom, but then he becomes a kind of career criminal, and it's only at the end of the book that he realizes that he has to join with other people into a collective whole. It's kind of a healing process to make up for the loss of his country, Lithuania, and his family as well. So
I think it was great. I think it's the first novel I've ever read where there was a Lithuanian hero
yeah,
or protagonist.
yeah. I wonder how the Lithuanians feel about the book if it's a big one back there. But it's funny because it's only because he read this account of a Lithuanian guy that this friend of his collected that he read when he was in Chicago, and he also. The key, too, was that when he was thinking about how he was going to transfer all his research into a novel, because he was basically acting like a journalist, and then he had to come up with a story to tell about all the facts that he gathered. He came across a Lithuanian wedding when he was wandering around in Packingtown, and so that kind of was the switch that put his brain into motion to begin the book with that wedding scene of Jurgis and Una, and then follow the pathway of the couple. He goes back to their when they're in Lithuania and they decide to come to America. They get to Chicago, and a lot of the early scenes of their struggles are really reflective of Sinclair's own struggles with his wife Maida and his young son David. They were living in genteel poverty in New Jersey, and his wife at one point tried to commit suicide. She was miserable. They were living basically in a shack, and so some of that feeling that when Jurgis says, I will work harder to make his family, to get his family out of poverty, that is very much Upton Sinclair saying, I'm going to write a book that will sell and get his family out of poverty, which eventually happened. They actually bought a place, a very nice farmhouse nearby, and they had a farm that they moved into. So they had much nicer living quarters that they moved into when he was actually writing the book in 1905, 1906. So.
Yeah, well, yeah.
So a bit of autobiography as
Yeah.
well as the immigrant group there.
Yeah, I love all that.
But it's amazing how he mastered the whole family structure of that group of immigrants. The father Antanas and the stepmother and the stepmother's sons, and the extended family that all with very believable immigrant personalities, and the children who were struggling. One of which dies of food poisoning at one point. So he did a good job of presenting this representative extended family of immigrants, and it was pretty much an arbitrary decision just to choose that group.
Yeah, I would say it didn't feel forced.
I mean, it was just one typical group. There were Germans. First there were Irish, then the Germans, and now it was Eastern Europeans who were coming to the slaughterhouses, and Polish and people from the Baltic states as well. So it was representative of that cohort of immigrants at the time.
I mean, I really enjoyed this book. I mean, I don't the reason why I enjoyed this book, I mean, aside from it being really well written and capturing these characters, is that I do still think that it's applicable to our immediate circumstances in the present day, and I imagine it's applicable in ways that different individuals picked out. You sort of alluded to the situation with regards to immigration in our country today, and how there could be people from uh, Mexico, Central America, South America, who may feel themselves in a position similar to Jurgis. I think the situation could also be very applicable to what's going on with technology and the internet and Silicon Valley. I think there's a way to that a reading of this would help us understand those conditions a little bit more, especially with how individuals are consumed on the internet or turned into products for these big internet companies.
Yeah.
And then I think it's also it's a good thing to sort of understand. You know, we don't see it a lot. We don't see how the meat is made with a lot of our technology, right? Like iPhones and things like that. We just think we don't inquire into the conditions. Like, what are the conditions in like China where these things are made?
Yeah, right.
Are these iPhones that we're so addicted to, are they made by people who are in similar circumstances to people like Jurgis in the slaughterhouses and stuff like that? But then I also think it's still really relevant because it's like there needs to be a sequel written to this. And I don't know if there is an unofficial sequel that takes into consideration this socialistic turn at the end. That's pretty much my only critique of the novel is that at the very end, it suddenly does take on an agenda, a very noticeable agenda. But
well,
I'm sympathetic to why Sinclair pressed it, but it seemed like he pressed it. It seems like he's like, I got to get this in there. And he kind of slammed it in there at the end. That I think he could have been, if I have any criticism of it, I think he could have been a little bit more subtle and delicate with it. But, really, other than that, I think it's a great book. I mean, these are my criticisms about why it's still relevant today and maybe how it needs an upgrade. That's what I would say.
Well, I think it just represents a sense of the sort of need for some kind of desperate remedy for what it felt like to live in, the era of these huge trusts where, the middle class was okay, but they were kind of sitting on a ledge between the big wigs or the big boys who had all the money, and then this abyss of struggling immigrants who were pouring into the country from elsewhere. But then you had the working classes who were gravitating towards factories more and more. So you had an industrial economy where you had millions of people working in factories, and they were kind of out of sight, out of mind, it was not a very happy place to be unless you were a comfortable middle class person or rich person. I would like to say though that in terms of the conditions of working in slaughterhouses, I mean this book it ties in with a lot of the more recent efforts to try to improve the quality of food. I mean, I'm thinking of the book Fast Food Nation of Eric Schlosser, which came out at the beginning of the 21st century, and that has a chapter on slaughterhouses and modern conditions that are really quite similar to what it was like, except now they're immigrants from Mexico and Central America who are working in the slaughterhouse, but you still have terrible accidents. I mean, the food isn't quite as contaminated, but the fact is that the rules of inspection have been liberalized and opened up because of corporate pressures. So you do have regular food poisonings of people because of failure of inspection. You have food recalls. I mean, you have all kinds of things. Most recently the lettuce issue, romaine lettuce. So you don't have you have a system where there are still flaws and loopholes where you can get sick. A certain number of people, I forget the figure, every year are sickened by food, and some die from E. coli.
That's interesting that you bring up the parallel to present day foodstuffs. I wonder I don't know. Some of the communities that I traffic in, some of them are very concerned about genetically modified stuff like
Yeah,
GMOs and Monsanto
yeah.
and all. I haven't really done my research on it, so I can't really speak to it. But I wonder if this book would would interest those communities. Do you research those issues at all?
Well, I'm only modestly, informed about that, but I think the whole concern with healthy food is anyone who reads The Jungle will immediately identify with conditions at that point because it was the same thing. It was big corporations, big food corporations. I mean, if you look, if there's the great movie Food Incorporated, Food Inc. I don't know if you've seen it, the documentary. If you go into a supermarket, a certain like a huge proportion of the food is produced by like 5 or 6 big corporate giants. It's all processed food. It's not healthy. It's we have devastating levels of diabetes because of sugar being put in everything, and everyone is overweight because of all of the calories that they get from their food. So it is it's still a very timely issue because of the power that these giant food corporations have, and they for instance, the beverage industry doesn't want to label, they don't want to restrict the size of drinks, these sugary drinks that are giving kids diabetes. They don't want to recognize the public health damage that they're doing because they're so wedded to their wonderful income from their products. So you have to have a very dedicated public who are putting pressure on government to make sure that the consumer is protected from the corporations that just want to make money. They don't care about the health of their customers. They just want to make money.
Yeah, that raises all sorts of interesting questions about um, when is consumer protection overreach. And that's an interesting, I think, political philosophy question that could come out of this discussion. But I know we have to sort of bring it to an end. But some people could see some people could see consumer protection as being paternalistic in some way. I don't, whatever the issue is. I remember a couple years back. People were. It was a big political issue about size of Slurpees or something like
Yeah. I was in
that,
New York,
or like,
and they,
yeah, or like with or just even like with cigarettes. Like people are like, it's
yeah,
my. I know cigarettes cause cancer, and I want to smoke them anyway. Like
yeah, yeah. Well, um, you know, it's when corporations hide the truth, or when they are gleefully marketing things that are ultimately bad for you, and the public health costs are borne by the public at large. If people can say, I don't want to have to pay for your medical treatment for something that you shouldn't be doing, because it's harmful. I mean, so there's a lot of factors at work
yeah,
there.
well,
Anyway,
that raises all sorts of things, right? Because then you could, and I'm not. But then it raises questions about, well, if that's the case, should we know all the deleterious effects of alcohol, right? Does that bring in prohibition concerns? I mean, it's a big stuff, and it's a whole other can of worms. But you know, but anyway, so I thought it was a really profound discussion, and obviously, I think if anyone's listening to this for educational purposes, I mean, of course, you're listening to it for educational purposes, but if you're looking to this to generate ideas for further research, further topics, I think we gave people a lot of material to work with. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
yeah.
Anything that I
Well,
didn't hit?
just it's there's a fascinating story about Upton Sinclair's relationship with Theodore Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt invited him down to talk about the book, because Roosevelt, he was a crusader as well, but and Roosevelt sent 2 people from the government to confirm the accuracy of the jungle, just to make sure that, if he supported Sinclair, that he knew that he was being, he wasn't going out on a limb. And so the guys who went to Chicago to confirm this, they came back, and then there was a movement in the Senate. There was a new bill that was drafted by a guy named Senator Beveridge, and the idea was that they should finally get some legislation to regulate, to increase inspections and to tighten up the industry. But the idea was maybe the House of Representatives wasn't going to pass anything. So Sinclair actually, he's a very astute marketer for his book, because he leaked what he knew about the report of Roosevelt's guys in Chicago confirming the accuracy of his depiction of the slaughterhouse circumstances. He leaked this to the New York Times, and so Roosevelt, they picked up the paper in the morning and they saw that the fact that the idea for legislation was kind of languishing in a Senate committee, and here was a confirmation of the fact that Roosevelt's agents had confirmed the truth of what Sinclair had written. So it kind of galvanized the bill back into action, and they eventually got it passed, and I think it was May 1906. So Sinclair was a very savvy marketer of his book, and he, but for a good end in that, they got a bill through Congress that really helped the American consumer, and, his book sold very well at the time, and it is still, in print, and it's been very influential. I think, an interesting fact is that George Orwell's Animal Farm was influenced by the jungle. You have the horse Boxer who's killed, who says, I'm going to work harder. So, the jungle has been very popular in England since the time of publication. It's been an influential book in Europe and in America. So there have been many, many editions, and so the book is, it really has been quite influential as a work of fiction and as a work of muckraking, so to speak, as well.
Yeah, that raises a whole other interesting question. If different economies, as they advance and come online, if there'll be sort of this rediscovery of the jungle as they sort of hit their own level of modification within the society. Like for instance, as well, I guess would be considered second and third world countries become first and second tier countries, if this book then becomes applicable to them in their own language. So that's an interesting idea to take into consideration. I mean, I wonder if people in India and China and other places will be reading The Jungle and then doing social critiques, and who knows, maybe they are. I don't know.
Yeah.
But okay. Well, thank you for another wonderful lesson, Dr. Cook, and we'll huddle. I think we were talking, we'll maybe look into some of Melville's Civil War poetry, and we'll huddle and think about our plan of attack for that. So I just want to thank you for everybody listening today. And you can go over and check this out at noetic.online very soon. I'll have the audio edited and up ASAP. So thank you to everyone.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
See you.